The teams are going to address the relevance and necessity of the Electoral College from a historical perspective, explaining the genesis of this method of electing the president, its development over time, how the system has worked over the years, the basis of recent challenges to the Electoral College, and any proposals rooted in the Constitution that are worthy of discussion. Participants are requested to speak in a normal tone and at a normal pace. I will give you time to make your points, but I will also expect you to listen to and respond to my questions. Once I start to ask a question, you are to stop talking, listen to the question, and provide a response to the best of your ability. If you are still in the process of answering a question when the 16-minute time expires, you are to ask for an additional minute to finish your response. So you now have 2 minutes to make your opening comments.
Thank you, Your Honor. James Madison once said, "The purpose of the Constitution is to restrict the majority's ability to harm the minority." Whether it was through the scope of population, separation of powers, education, or slavery, at the 1787 Constitutional Convention, every delegate had this issue in mind. It had been 13 years since the Declaration of Independence was signed, and an even shorter 4 years since the official end to the Revolutionary War. In that short time frame, these founders who had signed the Declaration saw implications of federal governments they had not expected. The mounting British debt, the interstate economic feuds, and the rebellious American people all showed the founders that the US was in need of change. The discussion became not about the necessity of democracy, but rather the proper extent of it. The American people should be given democratic involvement, yet too much involvement would leave way for a large, uniformed, and uneducated group to control any decision. The founders were forced to find a balance. As it currently stood, democracy was widespread on the lowest of levels, and each state was very strong as an independent governance. But in a time with little communication between states and relatively low education levels, the founders had to find something that was both universally accessible while still protecting the disillusioned voters. Hence, when it came to creating a method for electing the president, the founders decided on the Electoral College to give the people the representation they needed while creating a two-step safeguard of the president's office. Today, many of the worries that the founders had are long gone, but several still remain, and the Electoral College continues to stand as the imperfect but necessary compromise that, in ideology, which was what mattered most at the time, is an election by the people for the people. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to now start the timer. And my first question or request is that you discuss the origin of the Electoral College. How did it get in the Constitution? How was it initially structured? And what were the expectations of the system's proponents?
So at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Shays' Rebellion had actually just occurred. So the founders at the convention had saw the problems that occur when a direct democracy was given too much power. Shays' Rebellion showed that the American people were very capable of overthrowing their government and showing that rebellion. So when many people were opposed to a direct democracy at the convention, they knew not how to give the people the representation they deserved while still protecting the office from the easily swayed voters. So it was at first a main debate with the Virginia Plan coming in and introducing a system where the national legislature selected the government. And from that, many people disagreed and saw that the separation of powers was indeed necessary. And at that point, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, who hailed from Scotland, who was born, raised, and educated in Scotland, said that this form of indirect democracy was a great way to give the people the representation they deserved while still, again, safeguarding the office from the mob ideology, the mobocracy that the founders were afraid of.
How did slavery factor into the creation of the Electoral College?
So the southern states who were at the time, I believe most of them were heavily populated by slaves. At one point, one state was even up to 40% slave population. They worried that they would not have enough representation in not only in Congress, but also in the electoral process, that if their slaves were not given any value when it came to the number of votes they received on the federal level. So they decided to create that 3/5 compromise to give those southern states the representation that they desired.
Did were the slaves able to vote and get 3/5 of a vote?
Oh no, the slaves were unable to vote, but the number of electors is equal to the number of Congress people, and that number was decided. Each state shall have 2 for the Senate, which they called the upper house, but they also were to be given 1 vote in the lower house, which is now the House of Representatives, per every 40,000 people in the population. And the southern states saw we have such this huge slave population. We want representation for that.
Okay. What do Colin Powell, Bernie Sanders, John Kasich, Ron Paul, and Faith Spotted Eagles have in common? You don't have a clue. They all received at least 1 electoral college vote in 2016, which leads to the question. There's currently a case before the U.S. Supreme Court with a decision expected perhaps as early as this morning, dealing with the pledge that electors are expected to keep. This pits a system whereby electors are, quote, to be men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the station of president, end quote, versus one where electors are, quote, voluntary party lackeys and intellectual non-entities, end quote. Discuss the historical debate regarding this dispute and the pros and cons for each argument as to whether the electors could vote their conscience or whether the electors must be beholden to the way that the state's votes panned out.
So you could see throughout history there have been many examples where even when the popular vote was given to one candidate over another, the electors from a certain state still swayed in an opposite direction. And I mean, in regards to the ideals of our country, the ideals of the United States, and the intent of the founders, I think that the purpose of the Electoral College was to put a check on the power of the people, but not to limit that power of the people, right? So the idea that electors can, disregard the intent of the people through, their popular vote, the fact that the electors themselves are put into a position of quote unquote power by the people, I feel is, goes against the, traditional sense of protecting not only the democratic aspects of our country, but also, the republic aspects of our country, the freedom aspects of our country. I feel like,
oh, go ahead, Frankie, sorry.
no, you can go, it's fine.
I also believe that at the time, the position on which the electors represent the people has changed since the founders. Again, the founders were so worried that the average person could be swayed by any fancy talking politician that they wanted these electors to be knowledgeable not only of the government's functions, but also of candidates from all states. Their main worry was that in that time, people and also any other representation they could have created would be so biased towards the own personal state that the presidency would just be states running against each other. And one of the provisions that the Constitution states, which is seen even today, is that the electors get 2 votes, and at least one of those votes has to be given towards a candidate who is not from their state. So again, that stemmed from this worry that we need these people, these electors, to be knowledgeable of candidates on all fronts so we can have really fair representation of every candidate. And I love how that persists even today. Even though electors are now mainly loyal to their party, faithless electors haven't ever been seen as in history of the elections. There have only been 5 events of faithless electors, and in those events, it was inconsequential to the overall election. So I think the main idea that the founders wanted to give was that these electors should be knowledgeable of all candidates, and that in today's world, while this worry is less of an issue as we have the internet, we have all of these things, the average person is much more informed on their political views. It's still important to have um, representation for all of the states. For example, Bernie Sanders in Vermont, he in his own state, he received such large support from the populace of that state. But regardless, the electors of that state knew that they couldn't just only support their own people. They have to be involved on a national level. So that importance
Well,
is,
the electors of Vermont didn't vote for Bernie Sanders in the last election, did they?
no, they didn't. But that's the important thing, is that while the people of one state may be extremely loyal to someone who came from their own state, I feel that it's human nature to have that tribalism of pride for your own state. But that's where the importance of the electors comes in, is where we need to move away from that tribalism of loyalty to your own state and become more informed on a national level.
What are the arguments favoring keeping the system as is? And if you generally favor the system, but would be willing to make a small change, what would you propose?
I think that, back when the Electoral College was first being created, there are a lot of issues that are still prevalent today, in the fact that we kind of need that buffer between the people and the electives, right? You have the idea of states' rights, and the fact that smaller states would lose to larger states. Large populations would large populations would triumph over smaller populations. So the concept of having an electoral college there to kind of remove those fears of losing to a majority rule state are very prevalent. Even like going back to the idea of tyranny of the masses, it's an inherent weakness to a majority rule, and it exclusively pursues its own interests at the expense of others. And the Greeks, they were very readily aware of this, and even philosophy debates about the idea that even if the majority must rule, it shouldn't be at the expense of the minority. But one of the more interesting points that have been brought up is the fact that changing the electoral college, and of course we've seen this happen with the 12th Amendment and the idea that separate ballots would be cast for president and vice president. The attempt in 1969 to change the entire way that we vote. I feel like since the system has existed with very small, minimal changes for more than 2 centuries, right, 230 years, to change it now and to change it drastically would be, unintelligent due to the fact that we haven't had any, huge problems with the way that our representatives are elected.
What about are there any states that do it differently in terms of how their electors are committed to a candidate based on their vote?
So there are 2 states that do not have the all for one policy, or winner take all, I should say, I believe is the correct term. I believe one of those states is Nebraska. Frank, if you could find those 2. But I think in your previous question, you were asking if you could make a change, which would it be? So the original draft of the Electoral College does not include anything regarding the winner take all policy or an ideology. It was actually the 48 other states that came to that conclusion on their own in the early 1800s to give all of the votes to one. And I think that now, in a time when so many people are educated, there's less worry about having to there's less worry about having to give all of the votes to one elector in order to avoid like a non-majority vote where it was imbalanced and it would have to go to the Senate. I think making the Electoral College more representative of the vote of the people would be better in each state, allowing the electors to divvy up those votes to reflect the proportionality of the voters in their own state.
So in regards to the question, the two states that are being addressed in regards to the fact that they have, different methods than the 48 other states are Maine and Nebraska. And instead of having that idea that the winner is the one who receives the most votes, they have this idea where they break it down into congressional districts, kind of to, I guess, more localize the idea that it's the people voting and it's the people making an effect. But yeah, Maine and Nebraska.
Right. How would any changes to the Electoral College be effectuated, and what are the chances of this happening?
So of course, making changes to the Electoral College requires a rather laborious process, like we saw in 1969 with the proposed amendment to change the whole system, which requires acceptance by both houses in Congress to basically amend the Constitution and the way that we vote. But seeing that the failed attempt in 1969 to like completely change the way that we vote, I'd say that the likelihood of changing the entire system, making those drastic changes, is rather low until we get to a point where you see like very noticeable dangers to not only the rights of the people, but then the rights of the electors, the rights of the people being elected. I wouldn't say that it's totally impossible for change to be made, but I'd say it's very unlikely.
Okay, so twice in the last 20 years, the individual candidate that got the majority of the popular votes lost the election because of the Electoral College system. Is putting aside whether you like the person or not, is that a good thing for this country or a bad thing that the system worked out that way?
I think it depends on the logistics of where that majority was coming from of the popular vote. I mean, of course, if you take a look at the major blue states, New York, California, they have very large populations. So of course their vote, right, would go towards a Democrat candidate, and it heavily influences the outcome of the popular vote. But going back to the whole intent of the Electoral College, it's to prevent the majority from creating a dissonance that disregards the needs, the demands, and the opinions of those smaller population states. I know many argue that the fact that the popular vote, the candidate with the popular vote can still lose is very detrimental thing to the way that our system works. But I feel as though, like with the intent of the founders, they're truly democratic elections. The fact that majority rule are prone to fits of passion and the vices of demagogues and prejudice. So having that buffer of the Electoral College, even with the electoral vote, I think prevents decisions being made based on
I also think that it extends beyond ideology as well. It is very applicable in terms of policy. So the policies that meet the interests of those high population states differ drastically from the policies that meet the interests of the low population states. But what's to say that one of those policies is more important than the other? Having policies that protect all sections of the economy, whether that be from the number of social workers in the U.S. To the number of farmers in the U.S., it's important that while those numbers may statistically differ, the representation in our government is equal, such that we can meet the needs of the people to the fullest extent for everybody. So it forces candidates to appeal to those needs universally.
Okay,
I
well,
have
this
time.
16 I got it. 16
Okay.
minutes is run, so it's time for your closing statement.
Thank you, Your Honor. History is the foundation on which we can interpret our present knowledge and theorize about the potential for future events. Reaching as far back as ancient Greece, we are able to put together patterns in political, societal, and private life that offer insight into the proper way a society functions. These patterns, however, are not a result of mere chance, but a result of bravery, integrity, and intelligence in the face of new tasks and new feats. With the creation of the Electoral College, the founders of our country demonstrated that same bravery, that same integrity, and that same intelligence. The early minds of the United States had to piece together arguments, ideas, preferences, and demands in order to create a system that not only satisfied the masses, but protected the freedoms and liberty of our nation. From addressing the theory of majority tyranny to looking out for states' rights, from ensuring there were proper checks and balances to making necessary amendments to the system. The creation and historical evolution of the Electoral College is filled with decisions that follow those previously mentioned patterns, ensuring our states stay united. While it is important to debate topics through the lens of the modern world, we must never forget the seed from which those topics grew. And after growing for more than 2 centuries, the seed that is the Electoral College has developed into a strong system that not only supports the rights of the governed, but has succeeded in protecting the liberty of our nation. Thank you, Your Honor.